Leslie Nice. I work for Montana Fish, Life and Parks as a Fisheries Technician. I've been in the Bitterroot since 2002. And so we're here on Skalkaho Creek looking at a fish screen that's here behind me. And fish screens are an important part of irrigation systems across the West. And whenever you have irrigation is super important, obviously. In dry climates you need irrigation for agricultural purposes, maybe even for watering cattle. And so those irrigation structures are super important. There's diversion structures on creeks and rivers, and then those diversion structures usually take water or send the water down a ditch, and then from that ditch it travels, it could be a couple miles, it could be many miles, across the system, providing irrigation water to a lot of different ranchers and people that need that water. So of course there's consequences with having such structures. Large irrigation dams in a river or a creek can actually block fish migration. So sometimes you have fish moving from, say, up on the Bitterroot National Forest down to the Bitterroot River. And when those fish become older and more mature and want to return to Skalkaho Creek for spawning, those large diversion structures could block their movement back upstream. Likewise, ditches can potentially cause problems too by fish going down the ditches and becoming what we call entrained. So fish entrainment in those ditches, and that's why fish screens play a really important role. Once you install a fish screen on a ditch, the idea is the fish will go down that ditch, but then they'll run into the fish screen, and the fish screen has a design so that usually there's a pipe or some structure that will return the fish back to the creek or the river where they originally came from. So fish screens are really important. The fish screens here on Skalkaho Creek, it's a pretty unique system. So Skalkaho Creek is a really robust West Slope cutthroat and bull trout fishery. And those are our two native trout in the Bitterroot drainage. The other trout that you can think of are actually non-native here in the Bitterroot. So Skalkaho being a robust West Slope cutthroat and bull trout fishery, Fish, Life and Parks has been interested in Skalkaho Creek for a long time. In the early 90s, there was a Montana State University graduate study that looked at fish movement. And that study found that fish were moving around in Skalkaho Creek, moving from the creek down toward the river, and then some movement back upstream. Fish, Life and Parks has documented fish in ditches. There's three main ditches here on Skalkaho Creek, and luckily they're all run by the same irrigation company. So that makes it a little bit easier if you're going to work with an irrigation company that all the ditches fall within one irrigation district. In 2001, Fish, Life and Parks tagged West Slope cutthroat trout in the Bitterroot River, and then they tracked those fish, and quite a few of those fish actually made it up over the three major diversion structures from these ditches, and they made it up onto the Bitterroot National Forest, which is where they wanted to spawn. So that was pretty enlightening. We did not know that fish would be able to jump over these huge diversion structures, these big dams. And they're doing that in the springtime when there's a lot of water. So not only the amount of water that's coming over those structures, but the force of the water. And those fish are pretty amazing that they were able to jump over those structures and get up onto the forest where they had been born, so they were going back there to spawn. In 2002, there was a Skalkaho Creek fish passage and protection plan that was developed, and that plan looked at where fish were being entrained, in what ditches, and it also came up with strategies for possibly how to mitigate that, like the idea of installing fish screens. Then again, in 2003 and 4 and 2005 and 6, there were more graduate studies out of Montana State University. So the first grad study was Steve Gale, and he did his work before the fish screens were actually installed. And he tagged fish in the creek and then looked at where those fish moved. And unfortunately, a lot of those fish ended up going down the ditches. And those fish could go really far down ditches. Sometimes they would swim back out the head gate if they were a large enough fish, but if they were smaller fish, they don't have those swimming capabilities to withstand, you know, the amount of water. So they would just get washed down the ditches, and then of course the ditches shut off in the fall, and then those fish, you know, become food for predators, or they just die, maybe food for scavengers. So Steve really looked at the number of fish that were being lost to entrainment in the ditches. In 2004, fish screens were installed. And again, back to the Daly Ditches Irrigation District, so the 3 major ditches on Skalkaho Creek all received fish screens. And then the second graduate study was Ryan Harnish, and he came in after the fish screens were installed and looked at how well they were operating, how well they were working. Were they doing their job keeping fish out of the ditches? And yes, they were doing a good job keeping fish out of the ditches. And so the fish that were entrained in the first part of the ditch would run into the fish screen. The pipe would take the fish back to the creek and return the fish to the creek where they belong. And again, he found bigger fish were able to swim back out the head gates if they wanted to. So that's kind of where we are with the fish screens on Skalkaho Creek. Then there were 2 other diversion structures that crossed Skalkaho Creek, and they were actually river water. The Hedge and the Republican ditches come off the Bitterroot River. They would intersect Skalkaho Creek, and there'd be a mixing of water. And then unfortunately, river water would go down the creek, and creek water would go down the ditch. So kind of not what you really want. So in 2008, siphons were installed on those 2 big river ditches. So basically what happens is the water from the river gets to Skalkaho Creek. There's a siphon or a big pipe that was put in underneath the creek. So now there's no longer mixing of water. And that's actually really important for fish. If fish are trying to find their way back up Skalkaho Creek and up onto the Bitterroot National Forest, they do that using a variety of sensory clues. And so they need Skalkaho water to be directing them where to go. And so it's a really good thing that we have the river water separated out from Skalkaho water, mainly to help those fish. So that's kind of how fish screens work. Every system is a little bit different. There's a whole variety of fish screens that are out there. And just like a lot of other things in the science world, the technology is really developing. And we're learning more and more all the time about maybe what types of screens work well in some systems, maybe they don't work as well in other systems. And there is a maintenance factor involved too. So whenever you're putting structures like this in a natural system, there is going to be maintenance. It's ideal if there's low maintenance structures that you can put in to get the job done. And that's one advancement that we have seen in the fish screen industry is, you know, fish screens that maybe don't need quite as much maintenance, that can kind of take care of themselves, so that we're not out there all the time, or we're not hiring people to be out there all the time taking care of the fish screens. So that's kind of how it works. Again, Skalkaho is a kind of a fun, unique system in the Bitterroot where, you know, the fish screens exist. They're operating pretty well, doing their job, keeping fish in the creek where they belong. So here you can see a fish screen structure, and you can see here's the head gate, which is the main structure that is right off the creek. And so the fish, if the fish are moving downstream, and especially smaller fish that maybe can't swim as well, they will oftentimes get pulled into the ditch. And so they come through the head gate, and then they start moving down the ditch. If a fish screen is on the ditch, they'll run into the fish screen. And these fish screens that you're seeing are actually a flat plate fish screen. And so the holes in the plates of the fish screen allow the water to go through so that the ditch can still get the water that it needs. And then the fish kind of work their way down the screen to the outlet pipe. So usually at the end of each screen, there's some sort of outlet pipe that will take the fish back to the creek. So here you can see the outlet pipe. It goes underground, and then it takes the fish back out to Skalkaho Creek.